In week 11, we will be looking at units 48 through 52, which deal with the 19th century and the first part of the 20th century. Unit 48 is concerned with the democratization of religion that takes place. And I'm focusing here primarily on the United States. Following the American Revolution, which was a highly democratic revolution, we see the influence of this new democratic environment on the church. The church begins to mirror the new democratic society in which it finds itself. So what we're seeing then is that things that made more sense in a more autocratic society are being set aside. For example, in the United States, we see a lessening of the power and the force of Calvinism and a rise of Arminianism in the 19th century. And ironically, at the same time, we see that some of the Puritan influences begin to fall away, so that we see the rise of a more popular, more gentle form of Christianity that hadn't been seen for a couple of hundred years, that is, since the Puritan era. For example, we see then in churches the introduction of pipe organs, stained glass windows, Christmas is celebrated once again, and so forth. We see this as early as the 1820s and 1830s. The major thing, though, that this unit is focusing on is the camp meeting. The camp meeting becomes the new instrument that evangelical Christianity is using to spread the gospel in the frontier of the United States. And this camp meeting then becomes a style of religion that continues to be reflected in American religion even today. And to the extent that the American form of Christianity has spread around the world, it's also spread this camp meeting approach to evangelism. So this is an important unit to read to understand modern evangelicalism in the world today. Unit 49 is dealing with theological liberalism. And I begin by recalling the various ways in which the Enlightenment had challenged Christianity in the 18th century. And in some of the ways, those trends continue to develop and gain new force and power in the 19th century. For example, the introduction of lower and higher criticism, the rejection of the Bible as an historical authority, and so forth. Then we look at various ways in which theological liberalism that emerges early in the 19th century is in fact a reflection of the Romantic movement. The Romantic movement in many ways was a reaction against the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment put all the emphasis on human reason. It was all about thinking. It was all about your head. And the Romantics said it's not just about your head. There are other ways to understand the universe besides our reason. And they began to point to the importance of feeling or of the heart. And so the theological liberalism that emerges at this time is really a reflection of these Romantic sentiments, that religion should not be based so much on reason as it should be based on the sentiment of the knowledge of God that we have in our hearts. The leading theological figure from this period, who's known as the father of modern theology, and I would say more technically the father of modern liberal theology, is Friedrich Schleiermacher. In the last quarter or so of the 19th century, liberal theology takes on a new hue. It begins to reflect much more powerfully than ever before the belief that was true in the 18th century and in the 19th century in human progress that so characterizes the Western world. This idea of progress is reinforced by Charles Darwin, who in this same period is giving us a new image of progress, that is evolutionary progress in biology, which social thinkers have transferred to the social environment as well. Why is it that society is progressing? What answer would Christian thinkers give to this question? The answer that they had was God's immanence. Immanence is a word that means God's presence. Because God is present in our history and in our culture, in our developing science and technology, we are experiencing progress. This is the liberal view at the time. In units 50 and 51, we're going to switch from looking at theological liberalism to the conservative evangelical response to this environment, that is this new democratic environment, and this environment that continues to be reacting against the Enlightenment of the 18th century. There were two major theological thinkers or theologians that helped to invent what today we call fundamentalism. And they both come from Princeton Theological Seminary, Charles Hodge and Benjamin Warfield. So this unit will briefly look at their lives and their thoughts that formulate fundamentalism as we have it today. Fundamentalism we can see rising in America as early as 1870 and cresting around, at least intellectually, around 1920 or 30. In Unit 51, we'll pull back a little bit and take a wider view of the conservative evangelical movement. We've looked at fundamentalism, which is a theological trend, but there are three other movements that were also important at this time. One of these is premillennialism. Most of the Western world for a couple hundred years had been postmillennial in its thinking. That is, the idea was the world was getting better and better and better, and it was getting better because of progress, and at the culmination of this progress, we would see the return of Christ. Hence, postmillennialism. Christ comes at the end of the millennium, which human beings themselves will introduce. In the last quarter or so of the 19th century, there's a great feeling that that's not going to happen because the world doesn't seem to be getting better. In many ways, it's getting worse. It's certainly becoming more complex because of all of the social problems that the world was dealing with. And so we see then the rise of premillennialism, the belief that the world is getting worse and worse. At the end of this historical period, there will be a terrible tribulation, and at the end of that crisis, Christ will return. This premillennial view is reinforced by John Nelson Darby, who develops an idea called dispensational premillennialism. And this is the premillennialism that we know today around the world that's being advertised and sold in church bookstores everywhere. And then we also see, secondly, of these three movements that we're dealing with in this unit, we see the rise of the holiness movement. The holiness movement was an aspect of perfectionism that was a trend of the 19th century. But 19th century holiness movement itself was an extension of John Wesley's idea of perfectionism. And so this becomes one of the major themes of conservative evangelicals. And emerging out of this theme at the very beginning of the 20th century is Pentecostalism. So Pentecostalism's language and its theology, to a large extent, is derived from this earlier holiness movement. Lastly, in Unit 52, we will look at the challenge of the big city. Remember that we're seeing the rise of huge cities all over the world in the last half of the 19th century. We're also seeing the rise of the great factory system. We're seeing society divided in a way it never had been before. It's at this time that Karl Marx informs us that we have three classes. We have a lower class, a working class. We have a managing class, which is often a professional or business class. And then we have the owners, the rich class. In previous centuries, in Europe, in England, even in America, people didn't talk about classes. They talked about ranks. You held a different rank in society, and these ranks were not opposed to one another because people had an organic view of the world. These different ranks in society worked together. Karl Marx is arguing, no, society is divided into classes which have their own distinct interests, and they're often fighting one another for dominance. In this tense environment, Christianity is trying to figure out how to be responsive and how to be responsible morally. And it comes up with two possible solutions to deal with the various social problems rooted to the factory system, to urbanization, and to the class problems that I referred to. One solution is the individual gospel. The other solution is the social gospel. The individual gospel is best presented by the greatest evangelist of the 19th century, Dwight Moody, who focuses his evangelical efforts, or his evangelistic efforts, on the great cities and their specific problems. But he doesn't say that there are systemic problems in the world. Rather, he says that all the problems that exist in our social society are due to individuals. An individual is lazy, or an individual drinks too much alcohol, or an individual is improvident for whatever reason, and therefore they simply need to be converted, to give their lives to Jesus Christ, and all of the social problems that we have in this world will slowly dissipate. Others disagreed with that. Others said, no, the problems here are not individuals, are concerned with individuals, because an individual can be a good person, a hard worker, a good father or mother, and still, for whatever reason, fail. So the problems that exist in our society then are systemic problems. They're problems that are wrong with the society itself. Those who thought in this way included a group of people that call themselves social gospelers. Those who believe that the kingdom of God is about changing the nature of our society. The leading figure that I'll talk about in this unit is Walter Rauschenbusch, who writes one of the most interesting books of this period about what he calls the social problem. And his solution is a social solution, not an individual solution.